Good afternoon, welcome to the UK Column Live. It's the 24th of May, it's 2 o'clock. I'm here with Brian Gerrish and Ian Crane this afternoon. Before we start just talking with Ian Crane, we're going to have a brief flick through what's been going on in the press over the last 24 hours. And I would like to personally start with a close friend of us here at the Column and my radio show, Pie and Mash Films. Bill Maloney made a documentary last year, I believe it was, Adam Rickwood and the Medemsley Heroes, about a victim of a paedophile ring to do with a senior prison officer at the Medemsley Detention Centre. And the Guardian newspaper picked it up, I think it was last week, and yesterday it was brought into Prime Minister's Question Time. And unfortunately can't play a little clip, but I'd just like to run through what was said in the House yesterday. So it begins with Michael McCann, who's an MP for Labour, who says prison officer Mr Husband abused young men in Medemsley Detention Centre for decades before he was prosecuted and sentenced for his crimes. A constituent who was abused by Husband has given me information which suggests that senior figures in the establishment knew what was going on. The CPS refused to pursue these matters, and instead the Home Office has sought to issue compensation payments. Mr Speaker, young men were detained by the state and then they were abused by the state. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that a full inquiry is necessary to ensure that justice is done and is seen to be done? And David Cameron's response to this was, I first think, the first thing that the Honourable Gentleman should do, and I'm sure he already has, is to make sure that any evidence he has of abuse or cover-ups of abuse or compliance with abuse is given to the Crown Prosecution Service and given to authorities so it can be properly investigated. Now that's very, very interesting, especially with a certain case that UK Column are dealing with regarding Oxford and Cherwell, Brian. Would you not agree?
Yeah, absolutely. If I just comment on what Mr Cameron said there, obviously he's being told that it's the state that has failed in its duty, so that's the first thing pointed out to him. And then effectively what Mr Cameron does is refers it back in a circle, back into the organisations and instruments of the state to deal with the problem.
Yeah.
What people are telling us, and we, the UK Column, we are getting 3, 4, 5 phone calls a week from people who are talking about problems with the police. It can be to do with money, fraud, it can be to do with children.
Yeah.
And what they're continually saying is that when they attempt to take forward a complaint with the police, that the police are not acting on it. And if they then, it doesn't matter how much evidence they've got, they can have factual evidence, they can have documentary evidence, there can be multiple witnesses. But what then happens is that basically the police are refusing to actually do anything. So for David Cameron to stand up in Parliament and then basically all he's doing is referring people back to the Crown Prosecution Service is very interesting, because they're not doing things. But the one that you're referring to, the Oxford and Cherwell Valley College, this started for us about 4 months ago now, where we were contacted by individuals who'd attended the college, and they were talking about some pretty horrific abuse. Their allegations were that students in the college were being sexually and physically abused, included boys and girls, that students were being shown pornography, which included child pornography and some material which is too horrific to describe.
Yeah.
And what they said is that when they come forward to report this, not only was the college not taking the proper action, but they were, well, we've just got a slight interruption. The allegations that the students were making was just, were incredible.
Yeah.
And because from the outset for us it wasn't one person making an allegation, it was a number of people, we followed through on the story. And what that then leads you into is the fact that victims of what was happening in the college did the right things. They spoke to members of staff, or in some cases they actually were then put on to the people supposedly there in a protection capacity. And those people not only did not take the correct action, but they also warned the people off. And in some cases, they warned off members of staff.
Okay.
Right, so basically victims in the college were reporting it. They were reporting it to members of staff, and we understand that some members of staff were taking the right actions and they were attempting to report it, but the information goes around in a loop.
Yeah.
And the key to it is nobody investigates, and then surprisingly there's no evidence collected, so therefore no crime took place. It's a circular loop of a cover-up. And the Oxford and Cherwell Valley College, I'll call it a story, but we're talking about real events, is getting bigger and bigger because there's now multiple victims coming forward. Some of them can corroborate each other's stories, and in other cases it's obvious that what they're saying is truthful because the timings and circumstances correlate with what had happened to other people. Plus, we're seeing documents now, documentary evidence, which is clearly showing the authorities covering up. And a key point for people to understand is that the moment we're dealing with the safety of young people, we've got these child protection boards, which include local councils, the police are involved, charities are involved, such as Safeguarding Team, the Safeguarding Board. So by the time you end up with local authorities, charities, the police, government departments like the Department for Education, they're all working together. The moment one of them has made a mistake, what are they going to do? Are they going to cover up because the police sat in the decision-making process? Are they going to cover up? And it seems that there's this circle starts where each one can't break the circle because they would also be implicated in cover-up. Now, that is clearly going on in Oxford, but it's very interesting because over the last few days there's been an inquiry into a college called the Adam Smith College up in Kirkcaldy, which I believe is Gordon Brown's constituency. And when you read the reports, we've got exactly the same thing going. Same sort of thing alleged there, that basically there's talk about intimidating behaviour and bullying by staff. They're also talking about misuse of funds, and I believe in this case, I believe that this relates to the issuing of qualifications, because with these colleges, the more qualifications they issue, the more money comes in. And this is something else that was pointed out at Oxford and Cherwell Valley College, that members of staff were apparently being asked to sign off qualifications as being awarded, reached, achieved, when they hadn't. And this is basically fraudulent use of the education system. So there's a pattern. But with the Kirkcaldy one, and it's just my last comment on this, we've got one of the members of the Scottish Parliament, his name, of course, I'm going to forget now. Let me just see if I can call it up. Here we are. It's Kirkcaldy member of the Scottish Parliament, David Torrance, and he said that the police should be brought in if the allegations relating to the college funds were substantiated. Now, I find this really interesting that you've clearly got something wrong at the college. It isn't the police that are coming in to investigate. The crime has got to be substantiated before the police are brought in.
Right.
Is it just me, or is there something mixed up here? Same stuff is going on at Oxford and Cherwell Valley College. David Cameron doesn't say in Parliament that we should bring the police in.
No.
He said actually you should take it to the Crown Prosecution Service.
Which is civil.
Well, at the end of the day, the Crown Prosecution Services are the same barristers and lawyers who are operating the court system and making millions out of it. So there's some very worrying things going on here.
Very worrying, very worrying. Anything that you've found, and we'll kind of take it in turns to go through a bit of news articles.
Well,
we're
we're on to delicate subjects at the moment because we're talking about children, but as I always say, children are our future. The article I picked up on was some comment that's been in the press today about Google, where Google is saying that they can't do anything to put a block on pornography on the internet.
Right.
And I'm just fascinated at the comments that Google is making, because to me they are quite obviously nonsense, and I think we ought to be challenging them. So we've got the Google's head of UK public policies, a lady called Sarah Hunter, and she believes that the government's plan for a bar on adult content would give parents a false sense of security and would be a mistake. So we know that Google is directly facilitating not only pornography, which some people may consider acceptable, but at the end of the day, by the time it's sadomasochistic or worse, this huge organisation is obviously polluting people's minds, and particularly young children. But she makes a comment in which she says that Google has no idea how much money they make from advertising alongside online pornography. So here's a company that's whole ethos is about collecting data and information on people, marketing trends, and this woman thinks that the British public is so stupid that they think that her company doesn't know how much money it makes out of pornography. I mean, it doesn't make sense.
It's funny that you're actually saying that, before we carry on, that they can find out who's illegally downloading and things like that, but then they can't find out about pornography.
Well, she says here a bit later on, she said that we do not break out our revenues for any area. Now, I think what she means by that, she's trying to say that Google doesn't break down its revenue into discrete areas, to which I say any business does that, because if you don't know what revenue you're making from one particular product line, you're not going to be in business long. So I'm going to say that either Sarah Hunter is an idiot, is the right word, because I don't believe this, or else she's trying to deliberately deceive the public into what's going on.
She's got some connections, hasn't she, as well?
Well, not Sarah Hunter, but the thing that's jogged my memory when I was looking at Google is a little while ago, and most people will probably have forgotten it, we had a lady called Rachel Whetstone who started to appear in the public arena, global vice president, global vice president for Google, specialising in public affairs and communication. And her claim to fame at the time the media reports came out is that her partner was Steve Hilton, who was Cameron's strategist, and I understand they later married. But it goes further than that, because of course this wonderful couple were also godparents to Cameron's late son.
Right.
So it's quite remarkable that we've got Google at the moment running pornography or facilitating pornography across the whole internet. They can't do anything to stop that. It's our responsibility as a parent to stop people viewing. But when we dig into the relationship between Google and the government, we find that senior Google officials are intimately connected with David Cameron. And it goes deeper than that, because this lady was also connected with Mr. Howard from the Tories as well. Yeah. So it seems to me that Google isn't just a company sitting on the sidelines of British politics. Google is actually embedded into the heart of government.
Yeah.
And what we should be doing is saying, what is the relationship between Google and the British government? And what are we going to do to get Google to take the common sense step, which is to block the internet pornography?
We just had a message, well, we're just online, we just had a message from Vinny, who's trying to get in touch with us, Mike, at this point in time.
Okay.
He's got his headphones on, can't hear.
Well, we'll carry on.
Yeah.
I think there's two issues here. First of all, from a business standpoint, it's quite obvious why Google really want to pussyfoot, no pun intended, around the pornography issue. Yeah. Because I can remember, I think it was about 5 years ago now, but I read a report that stated that in the US, 90% of all non-business related web activity was pornography. Right. And that's non-business related. So and that's an enormous amount of traffic. And of course, the bottom line is that in reality, it appeals to a very significant chunk of the adult population. And so consequently, Google or probably any other company is not likely to willingly give up information on how much revenue they generate from this particular industry. And so consequently, it's no wonder that Google are developing, if you like, symbiotic relationships with governments right across the planet. It's not just Canada. I mean, it's another classic example of the globalist control, the globalist infiltration. Because Google has an interest in governments keeping out of its business, which basically means giving it a free hand, particularly on the area of pornography, because of the phenomenal levels of activity and revenue associated with it. And governments, of course, in return, want Google to make sure that they are lifting the current spin from the respective government to the top of the table in terms of news items and suppressing anything to counter. So this symbiotic relationship, it needs to be broken. It's not obvious how that's going to happen. It's almost like trying to separate church and state.
Well, the first bit is to identify what's actually happening, isn't it? So I think we're starting to break the relationship because we're examining it here on this show, but the more other people that start digging in and asking the right questions, get out there and ask your MPs. What it is. And the other little thing which perhaps I could just drop in there is that the interesting thing with this relationship is that at the moment we've identified Google and connections with top-level executives of Google and government. The other thing that Steve Hilton was doing was sitting on the government behavioural insight team. And this is part of the Cabinet Office set up where they are using applied behavioural psychology to change the way. So we're not just seeing one part of the picture. It's not just a question that the internet giant Google is mixing it with the government. We've also got government bodies which are deliberately, well, it's not they're plotting, they're doing it. They are trying to manipulate our behaviour with applied psychology. And those cells are clearly also working with Google.
Well, there's absolutely no question about that, Brian, whatsoever. I mean, this would have been Joseph Goebbels' wet dream.
Yes.
To be able to have this tool, not having to rely on newspapers or radio. Now literally to be putting it out real time. I mean, this is Bernays on acid. And absolutely, I mean, it goes way beyond just applied psychology, because every major marketing agency on the planet today employs neuroscientists.
Yes.
And it's employing neuroscientists on six-figure salaries. The neuroscientists are earning way more than they could ever dream of earning if they remained in academia or in medical research or whatever. And what they're doing is they are blatantly literally programming the future young adult. So a lot of the advertising, a lot of the information is aimed almost at the prepubescent teen, because whilst the front temporal lobes are still in the developmental stage, they are extremely susceptible. And in fact, very recently, there was an article in one of the marketing magazines. And it was actually questioning the morality of a company that had recently won a major marketing contract with the National Lottery. And the company concerned, I won't mention it by name, but its initials are BB, for those who do know. And basically the article was questioning the morality of the campaign because it was quite evident that the marketing campaign for scratch cards developed by this particular company was not aimed at adults. It was literally aimed at kids. Yeah. And of course you can't buy a lottery ticket until you're 18. Yeah. So what it was literally doing was, here is the National Lottery effectively investing money in the future business by creating a mentality amongst prepubescent and early pubescent teens, so that as soon as they're 18, they rush out and spend every damn penny they've got on scratch cards because it's the fastest way to get rich. Yeah. Yeah. And this is now, these techniques are being perfected, and they're no longer just the domain of the marketing agencies. in product advertising, they are now being employed by governments.
Yeah.
So, as you rightly say, it is literally programming the. Unfortunately, it's a very poignant observation. But I mean, what is being created by our education system is mindless drones who will jump on the hamster wheel to chase the latest materialistic accoutrements, must-have materialistic accoutrements.
Yeah.
So that it's feeding this consumerist materialism, and as Zbigniew Brzezinski said 40 years ago, preventing people from realising who they truly are.
Yeah.
It's very, very sophisticated.
Yeah, and the other bit I'm watching because I know Lou's got some other questions for you, but one little thing which I'd add, at the moment you get into the behavioural insight team, and of course you're coming up against the government's terminology. Applied behavioural psychology is calling it nudging, because that sounds sort of simple and nice. Nudging is applied behavioural psychology. And then we have people like Thaler and Sunstein at the back of it, where Mr. Sunstein said, well, anybody who dares to question this is a conspiracy theorist, and they should be fined or taxed out of existence. So we're definitely on the right lines with what we're looking at. For some people, the scale of it is a bit challenging, but we just need to expose it.
Oh, absolutely. Well, of course, I met this head on last September, when a series of serendipitous events occurred, and the British Humanist Society was planning a day at the Conway Hall in London, and basically it was going to be effectively the government's academics and think tanks almost having a day of masturbation. That's the only thing I can put it as. Getting off on the basis of demonising anybody who has a view counter to that of orthodoxy. Yeah. Well, one of the speakers, David Aronovich, was apparently sick and called off, and so I was invited to participate in this event. And the other speakers were Professor Christopher French from Goldsmiths University, who I have never seen such a more moronic, condescending, ignorant presentation as Professor Christopher French put over that day. Mm-hmm. Then he was followed by Dr. Karen Douglas, who is a doctor of psychology at Kent University, and she has written a number of papers on the psychology of conspiracy theory. And the bottom line is that her shallow, and her research was so shallow, and I stated this on the day, which of course drew cries of foul from the academics in the audience, but it was shallow, because she was claiming that she had researched the perception and the views of conspiracy theorists. Well, she hadn't. What she had done was she had got a random selection of her own students who had never necessarily shown any real interest in what was going on in the world, and simply asked them a bunch of questions. Yeah. And then she said, conspiracy theorists are just as likely to believe that Osama bin Laden is alive as he is dead. And, I just tore it apart. By the way, the third presentation was from the Demos twins, Carl Bartlett and Jamie Miller, who were affectionately nicknamed the 118 twins because of their resemblance to the and once again, they basically tried to claim that what they were striving to achieve was intellectual integrity, when in fact, of course, they were doing the complete opposite. What they were trying to do was put together a strategy that could go into schools that could literally force people to accept that the orthodox version of events was the gospel truth, and that anybody who dared question it was indeed in need of serious medication. Well, I was the last to present, and all of these presentations are available, by the way, on YouTube. And I literally asked them the very, very hard questions, and took parts of their presentation and effectively just took them apart. And then in the final Q&A session, I think it was Carl Miller just lost it. This was a classic indication of a guy whose who had literally had the sort of left brain slide poured across, and refused to look at any information that might actually cause him to have to change his worldview. And clearly what I had presented was causing him such concern, such internal turmoil, that he basically went off on a rant. And I mean, I nearly grabbed the microphone and asked if anybody in the audience had some Xanax, to try and get him to calm down. But this is the reality. And it's the point that I made at the goal of the mainstream is to tell people what to think. It's to save them the bother of thinking for themselves and just putting information out there and saying this is the point of view. It's why I read the Daily Mail and the Sun every day of the week, because by reading these papers I know what a significant chunk of the adult population in this country believe to be the gospel truth. And that gives us a start point at which we can then offer a counter. And our counter, of course, and the work that you guys do with the UK column and the rest of the alternative community, is we do not expect anybody to take anything we say at face value. The role that we try and fulfill is simply to stimulate people's own curiosity. And we ask them to actually take responsibility for the information that they have and do their own research and come to their own conclusions, and not just take what's in the rags and on the British BS Corporation news every night. But they are getting so concerned that people are waking up to their lies and their deceit and their obfuscation, and we should actually take it as a compliment that they are now spending millions of pounds on propaganda, on neuroscientists, on the applied psychologists, bringing them into government to try to shut down independent thinking. I think it's a tremendous compliment.
That links us quite nicely in, actually, with regards to the BBC and what they're doing, because a link was posted on Facebook yesterday about a BBC article that was written saying barcode everyone at birth with implants. So you see this is being posted onto a blog, but then you hit the original link, and I've got it in front, so I'll just show you so you can see for yourself, Ian. You hit the link, which is connected to www.bbc.com. You hit the link, us being in the UK, and it involves us in the UK, our British children, newborn babies to be in front, and the BBC won't allow us to access that information in the UK, even though it's an article on the BBC, and as far as I believe we pay the licence fee, and we are being denied by the BBC for us not to see that information, which just is unbelievable.
Well, but we see this time and time again. Exactly the same strategy was applied and is still being applied around the Gulf of Mexico, where there are news items that are being put out around the rest of the US which state that the Gulf of Mexico is all cleaned up, there's no problem with the sea life in there, but people who live around the Gulf Coast are banned from seeing that information. So in the same way as this is being restricted to people with IP addresses in the UK, it's the same in the Gulf of Mexico. And even, I mean, as recently as yesterday, somebody sent me a photograph they'd taken of massive areas of dead fish in the Louisiana marshes. And yet that information is not permitted to be seen by the residents of the Gold Coast area. And it's certainly, that information would be restricted from going into the rest of the US as well. But this is how they manage it. So what people overseas see is they see this from the BBC and they think, oh, the people of Britain must be actually acquiescing to this whole idea of chipping at birth, when of course the complete opposite is the truth. And if they did allow that article to be shown in the UK, there would be absolute uproar.
And I think it is just somebody writing an article, but it's the whole fact that us as paying for our licence fees.
It exposed the relationship between the BBC and BBC Worldwide operating as a private company.
Oh, it does,
But let's not belittle this issue.
No.
Because the whole issue of microchipping, and I mean, this is one of the reasons that I brought Greg Nicoletos over to the UK almost 3 years ago now, in November of 2009. to give a presentation at the AV3 event in Bristol on the microchipping agenda, because Greg, in my opinion, is probably the guy in the world who has got his finger on the pulse in terms of the microchip technology. Yeah. And so everything that article is talking about, Greg was presenting 3 years ago. We know, and we can even go back to Zbigniew Brzezinski's book, Between Two Ages, The Technotronic Era, when he was talking about exactly this kind of technology. I mean, this is the mark of the beast. I mean, this is what, I mean, the governments want this. They want to go to a cashless society where everything is done through card transaction, so they can monitor it, because they want to be able to tax it, because they perceive it as the fastest means to be able to shut down any kind of tax evasion or tax avoidance. But of course, it is far more pernicious. It is literally about the total control of the individual. And I mean, it opens up a whole new can of worms, because, you know, we're getting into the area of the rapid advancing agenda of smart meters. Yeah, you know, where smart meters will have the capacity to literally track every single move you make within the house. When you open the fridge, you take out a bottle of milk, or you take out a pack of bacon, and that transaction is monitored. So basically, you could log in, somebody could log in and literally monitor an individual's behaviour. Oh, at 9:30 every night, this guy goes out and makes a cup of tea, or whatever. Yeah. We've already got the situation in clothes, where most clothes sold in Marks and Spencer's have an RFID chip in for the alleged purpose of stock control. But now, when you purchase those clothes in Marks and Spencer's with your card, because obviously the barcode of the clothes is scanned to bring up the total cost, then you pay with your card, and immediately the barcodes of the items of clothing you just bought are then linked to that card. And so we're not a million miles away now from a situation where people are walking down the street and the RFID receivers are literally able to pick up the fact that Lou Collins is walking down the road wearing a blouse that she bought in October of last year with a skirt that she bought whenever, and underwear that she bought from Victoria's Secret or wherever a few months previously. I mean, this is outrageous, but this is where it's heading. It's absolutely where it's heading, and people absolutely need to understand. That's why, by the way, I never buy clothes with credit card. I always pay cash, because if they're bought with cash, they're scanned, but they're not in any way, shape or form linked to me. Yeah. So people have got to get smart about the way in which they play the system.
I mean, really, we could look at it as we're being attacked. We're under attack. The British people and the citizens of the world, almost, well, especially here in the UK, in some form of attack. We may not see it how it was back in the 40s, but we are under attack, aren't we, Brian?
Well, this is where I started with the talks that I did, because I've said this at some of the early talks. The day I really began to think was reading a book written by Christopher Story, who has, in his time, has done some fantastic investigation and research. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us. But that book, The European Union Collective, Enemy of its Member States, that book contained a table where a Soviet defector going back into the mid-70s was talking about them, so he's talking about the Soviets knowing that there was a plan to basically break down and destroy democracies. And the plan was to demoralise Western states. So we just keep this country in mind at the moment, but it was to demoralise people over 20, 25, 30 years. And then, when they'd been softened up, it was actually going to be to destabilise. So you were going to start to see a breakdown of people and business and everything else. And I read it. Okay, my background is military, and I started to think, whoa, this is a bit like military material I was reading. So I went and made a second cup of tea. Yeah. And then my mind was saying, when I looked out the window, we're being attacked. Yeah. And the reason that I think is important to keep this in mind is We speak to the older generation who are still around, and they are still around, and they remember wartime, and they know then that we were being attacked, but it's guns and bullets and bombs. We are being attacked now, but it's psychological warfare, but it's still warfare. And at the end of the day, we know that people are suffering and people are dying as a result of what's been being done to us. Something that's very emotive, and we get a lot of information in at the moment from people in the NHS. And good people in the NHS are reporting that they're seeing chaos in hospitals. They're seeing big companies appearing on the scene like Serco, that's running everything from nuclear facilities to prison facilities and transport all over the world. They're now into hospitals with doors marked leadership office, and I'm not making that up. But we're now starting to see hospitals becoming so chaotic. People are dying of disease or neglect or thirst.
Yeah.
Now, this is not accidental, and it's a very important hurdle to get over, because a lot of people have looked at this and said, well, it's a shame and it's incompetence and it's a mistake. It's not. This is a common ideology which has come through all the three parties, and it's gone over a number of years, but it's now getting worse. The moment people accept, they get over this really scary hurdle that we're being attacked, then you can start to deal with it. And I eased off in some of the talks. I eased away from talking about it as an attack. I would just be talking about what was actually happening. But if we look out the window now at what people are talking about in Europe, and we've got people shouting now that we are watching the European Union start to break down into chaos and violence, whether it's going to be in Greece or Spain or Portugal, and we're talking about the rise of right wing, well, could be the rise of left wing. We're talking about extremist ideology. It's all beginning to brew. And at the moment, I look at this country, and I'm going to say my personal experience says this country is being destroyed to an agenda. Society is being dismantled. Industry, education, national identity. It's an agenda. Applied psychology is part of it, so that they're trying to hide it. But we want to deal with it. We have to understand we're being attacked. So, little bit of advertising. When we're on the air again, we're going to be talking about this theme in a bit more detail. What is actually happening to this country?
Well, I mean, it's talking about being attacked still. I mean, you only need to walk outside and look up at the chemtrails at the moment and what's coming down and being sprayed on us, what's being put in water in some part of the country. And I mean, it's from every single level, on every part of our lives, education, health, what's going into our food, what we're breathing in. It's across the board.
And I can say in the beginning, I didn't know anything about those other areas, so I didn't know what was happening with the water, I didn't understand what was happening with the food. If I just take the food, which has been one of interest to me, because I like food in general, but Codex Alimentarius, and I meet people who are interested in growing things, or they're interested in organic foods, and they have no idea of what this legislation is about and the control. And you say, what is this legislation doing? Is preventing us from feeding ourselves.
So it's preventing us from staying healthy.
Correct.
You were talking about that, weren't you? Before Codex, I remember your presentations a few years ago, before it was implemented, or before the plans, to the preparation was starting to go in. You went out and talked about it like a year beforehand.
Before that. In fact, the presentation that I recorded in Totnes in October or November of 2007 is certainly one of my most watched YouTube videos. And in the aftermath of that presentation appearing on the web, what was really interesting was the appearance of people on natural health forums who were just dismissing me as a rampant conspiracy theorist, and I quote unquote. And I was actually touring a number of tours around this country with a guy called Scott Tipps, who is the president of the National Health Federation. The National Health Federation is the only consumer organisation that has a voice, the representation. They no voting rights, but they can actually participate in the discussions at the Codex Alimentarius Commission meetings. So here was two guys. One guy who is not into organic food or natural medicines per se. I mean, it's not my main area of interest, but it was very, very clear to me that this was a massive part of the control agenda. And so I started talking about the Codex Alimentarius Commission and the role of Codex in terms of literally having a program in place that would ultimately make all natural farming effectively illegal and would literally destroy all natural health products, because the agribusiness, driven primarily by the likes of Monsanto and Cargill and Syngenta rather, and then in the natural health arena, natural health is all about preventative medicine, whereas big pharma is about effectively just keeping you on a revenue stream. And big pharma doesn't want people doing anything that prevents them from becoming sick. It wants people to get sick because its business ethos is very simple, and that is that every human life form is a potential revenue stream from the moment of conception to the moment of death. And on the 1st of May last year, 2011, the EU put on the statute books a piece of legislation called THUMPT, the Traditional Herbal Medicines Products Directive. Now, what is interesting about directives and regulations is that when the EU issues a regulation, it means that every member government is required to effectively institute that regulation with immediate effect. When there is a directive, it means that, look, you can go through the motions, you can make it look as though you're making the call on a national level, but you've got 2 years, basically. You've got 2 years to go through the motions and get it on your statute books. So the reality is that by April the 30th of 2013, all natural health products have to be removed from stores right across the EU unless they have been specifically approved. And of course the approval process is so expensive and so labour intensive that very, very few companies, other than the majors like the big pharma companies, can go through it. So what's happening is systematically natural health products are being removed from the shelves right across the EU. And the natural health community, with a few exceptions, has done nothing. And this is a classic example of how an entire community, and supposedly an independent thinking community, like the alternative health industry, can literally be blinded into doing nothing and effectively participating in the destruction of their own industry. It's incredible.
But blinded, yes, because material's going out which is stopping them seeing the right things, but a lot of people are still just not reading and they're not picking up on the signs that are there.
Wait, do you remember, Brian? I mean, a couple of years ago, Brian and I took a train journey. We were going to speak at a conference together in Kirkcaldy, interestingly, which you mentioned earlier in the programme. We were on this train from Devon going all the way up to Scotland, and it was in December, and the weather was so bad that a plane had been cancelled from Birmingham to Edinburgh, and so the airline had moved everybody on to the train. Now, Brian and I were sitting at a table seat, and there was a couple that came along and sat opposite us, and one of them was a nutritionist, wasn't she? She was a nutritionist, and she had never heard of Codex Alimentarius, and she probably remembers this journey just as well as I do, because we seriously rocked her worldview.
Come on then.
Well, her husband, I mean, to be fair, her husband was actually a lot more open to what we were saying.
Well, I think I think it was embarrassment with her, because of course we were talking about her industry,
and she knew nothing about
it. He was a little bit more detached. They were a very nice couple. We'd like to meet them again. But it was just interesting to watch, because everything we said, well, do you know about that? No. Do you know about this? No. And then there was her look of disbelief. What these guys are saying to me can't be true.
Oh, great.
But yeah, she was certainly educated when she got off the train.
Well, she didn't quite have the reaction of Jamie Miller, but you know, I mean, there was no question that she was very disturbed by what we were saying. She didn't want to believe it, but I think she could tell that we knew enough, or certainly more than she did, and so she couldn't actually just dismiss it.
No.
And because, I mean, obviously Brian and I were sort of being very supportive, and we were playing a bit the good cop, bad cop.
I can picture it now.
He was the good guy.
Yeah.
He was the good guy, and then I was the sarcastic bugger.
But we were basically well behaved.
We were.
Of course, the other thing which is always true in these situations is while we were talking to those two, the people
all around,
people opposite and around, you could just hear that there was a bit of earwigging going on.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
And that's the way to do it.
Yeah,
exactly.
It is, definitely.
Yeah.
Well, before we have a good old long chat with Ian, should we just finish up on what's hit people's eye over the papers, Ian? You haven't had a go yet. What's caught your eye?
Well, I think we'll probably touch on it again later on, but
Okay.
you know, I mean, what is, as we were talking earlier in the day, I mean, what is so incredible is, once again, just like Codex Alimentarius,
Yeah.
you know, well, we were talking about it years ago and were dismissed as sort of rampant conspiracy theorists.
Yep.
And I'm certainly from my DVD of 2007 called Fool Me Once, which I think is the first time that I actually recorded the observation where I said that we are on the brink of the global financial collapse.
Yeah.
And literally 1 month after I gave that presentation, I recorded that presentation, of course, Northern Rock collapsed. And you know, I was talking 5 years ago about the inevitability of the EU and the Eurozone countries effectively being destroyed, the economies of those countries being destroyed by removing what is the equivalent of watertight doors in a ship or fireproof doors in a hotel.
Yeah.
Because once one economy starts to go down, it's going to very quickly drag all the others down.
Absolutely.
And the ground was being prepared for this because of all the massive amounts of credit, which of course really means debt, that was being piled into these countries that they really had no possibility of being able to repay in any reasonable timescale.
Yeah.
And so here we are today in late May 2012.
Yep.
So we are 4.5 years, at a conservative estimate, we are 4.5 years into the global financial collapse. If we were in the 5th week or the 5th month, then perhaps it could be argued that, you know, governments and the financial community were caught unawares by what had happened, and they were still trying to find a strategy to get themselves out of it. Well, of course, we're in the 5th year, so that should be your first clue that there is no strategy and there's no intention of finding a strategy, because the desired effect is actually playing out.
Yep.
And that is that countries are literally being totally asset stripped. So Greece effectively no longer exists at the moment. And the bankers are ready now to let Greece leave the euro, because as far as the bankers are concerned, they own Greece. They own everything that's in Greece, because the Greek government has signed over to the European Central Bank and the IMF its national treasures, many of its public land, particularly on the islands. So, you know, as far as the bankers are concerned, they've literally stripped Greece of everything there is to strip it of. So now it can get out of the euro, and it can go try and rebuild its economy on its own, which it should have done, of course, 4 or 5 years ago. It should never have come into the euro at all. In fact, the guy that is currently the appointed head of the Greek government is a guy called Lucas Papademos, who was head of the Greek National Bank in the days immediately prior to Greece entering the EU, and along with his former employers, Goldman Sachs, he was manipulating the figures to try and demonstrate to the EU that Greece had actually met all the financial criteria for membership into the EU. And of course, you know, he knew damn well exactly what he was doing, and that is the guy, former member of Goldman Sachs, that is now heading the country. So now what we're seeing in the media today is, you know, the headline, well, page 2 in the Daily Mail, Germans ready to boot Greece out of the euro. Well, they've been given their instruction now. Because like I said, the socio-psychopathic global corporatists have stripped the country of everything that they want or that they think they can get. There's nothing really.
So Germany is really, isn't it? By the look of this, it's making out that Germany is the EU.
Well, Germany is the only sustainable economy in the EU. There's no doubt about that.
Okay.
There's no question. Germany is the only sustainable economy. Now, one of the things that's occurring here is that the euro crisis is, of course, sucking down that strong economy.
Yeah.
So Germany, in theory, is the only economy that is capable of achieving real growth at the moment.
Okay.
Right? Because it still has a very sound manufacturing base.
Right.
Most of the other countries have got rid of their manufacturing base and they're very much service oriented.
Yeah.
So Germany can still could still thrive, but of course part of the strategy here is to bring Germany down as well.
Right.
So that there is no sustainable economy whatsoever within Europe. And that allows the global corporatists to then sort of move in, appoint their own puppet leaders like Lucas Papademos in Greece, Mario Monti in Italy, and so on and so forth. So the smartest thing that could happen, and it should happen a long time ago, is that Greece, Ireland, Spain, Portugal, and Italy need to get out of the euro immediately. The only problem is to do that, it requires politicians with balls. Yeah. And there aren't any.
A bit like in Iceland.
There aren't any.
Well, and honest ones. It isn't just a question of courage, is it? It's actually finding politicians who are honest.
The problem, Brian, of course, is that the current players would not be in the positions they're in were they not tried and tested, safe pairs of hands.
Yeah.
The only reason that they are in the roles they are is because they have sold their soul and will do their master's bidding.
Told,
So unfortunately, we're going to be talking about this a little bit later again, but we are in a situation where again, it is the people who need to realise that everything that they have worked hard for is about to evaporate. It is about to be stripped away from them. In my opinion, they literally have a few months to wake up to this reality, because I think by the end of this year or early 2013, unless people actually wake up rapidly to the magnitude of the fraud and the deception that's being perpetrated upon them, then they're going to be living in a very, very different world, and one that they're not going to be very happy with.
Can I just throw Iceland in there? Because it's people often say to us that, particularly if it's people who are already waking up, they say to us, you're telling us more of the bad stuff and we can already see it's getting really bad. So I think we should just say a few words about Iceland. Would you like to?
Sure. And of course, this is why we have these events.
Yeah.
And of course, the Alternative View is partnering with the UK column on the London event on Sunday, June the 3rd.
Yeah.
The first event is in Dublin this Sunday on May the 27th at the Stillorgan Park Hotel. Then we move to Manchester the following Saturday, the Middleton Arena, and then down to London to the Marble Arch Thistle Hotel on Sunday. And the title of these events is Financial Terrorism Exposed. And the primary speaker, we've got some wonderful, wonderful speakers. Max Kaiser will be participating in all events with Stacey Herbert. Yeah. An amazing Irishman by the name of Thomas Sheridan, who's done some outstanding work on psychopaths in society.
Yeah, I spoke to him on Monday on the other show, so he was great, very interesting.
And his book, Puzzling People, is a very, very interesting read. In London, we'll also have Alessio Rastani, which always brings a smile to your face, Lou. You throw me there. Okay. Alessio will be actually talking about strategies that people can adopt to avoid literally being fleeced of everything that they have worked for. So this is very much...
And John Perkins.
Well, I'm coming to John Perkins, but I want to make the point, this is very much not about just talking about what's going on, it's actually about looking at solutions. It's looking at things that people can do individually and collectively, and to start sort of spreading the word collectively to sort of help get the message out. Now today we have an advert in the Irish Times, and the headline in the banner advert promoting the event in Dublin on Sunday is, why can't Ireland do an Iceland? And the question is being asked by John Perkins, And John Perkins, of course, is the headline speaker at these events. And John Perkins is a guy who, in a past life, when he was in his late 20s, early 30s, he worked with a company called Maine, which is effectively a consulting company fronting for the World Bank and the IMF, USAID and the likes. And his job was to deliberately get countries into debt.
Yeah.
Well, eventually he realised the error of his ways, and in fact, I mean, John Perkins acknowledges that there are probably at least 2 national leaders that were assassinated because he was unable to persuade them to buy into the infrastructure projects that he was selling them to get them countries into debt.
Right.
And those are the leaders of Ecuador and can't come to in a second.
Okay.
Anyway, John Perkins eventually sort of saw the error of his ways and decided that he needed to write a book about his experiences, and he couldn't find a publisher. But eventually in 2004 he did find a publisher, and the book was Confessions of an Economic Hitman. It spent 70 weeks in the New York Times bestsellers list.
Yeah.
And this is the first time he's ever spoken in Ireland and in England. And what he really brings to this particular event is his experience in Iceland, because when the Icelandic economy totally collapsed in late 2008, John Perkins thought, hang on a second, all of this rings a few bells here, because what he saw going on in Iceland was exactly what he was tasked to do in his role as an economic hitman. So he went to Iceland and he conducted his own investigation, and of course he pinpoints the primary villains who were in the lead role for dragging Iceland into massive debt was Alcoa. Now, of course, Alcoa is the global aluminum, or aluminum if you're American, manufacturing company. And of course, Alcoa is also one of the prime movers for getting fluoride put into the water, because fluoride is, of course, a waste product of the aluminium smelting process. And so by getting the fluoride dumped into domestic water supplies, then it means that they can actually sell this waste product, and of course force it into the neurosystems of a population. And Ireland is no exception, because Ireland has had fluoride pumped into its water for 40 odd years. But in conducting his investigation in Iceland, John Perkins wrote a book. The book was called Hoodwinked. That book has never been published in Europe. You can actually get it from Amazon.co.uk, but there is no European distributor for this book. Anyway, the book was read by a member of the new Icelandic government, the government that came into power in early 2009. And they invited John Perkins to effectively be a consultant and help them establish an economy outside of the construct of the central bank system.
Right.
And so consequently, this is why nobody's reading anything about Iceland, because it is a model of how an economy can be developed without the parasites of the private banking system.
Yeah.
Now, that wasn't the game plan. Of course, once they collapsed the economy, the game plan was that the global financiers were going to come in, and in fact one of the first knocks on the door was from the IMF. But the new government in Iceland, which was primarily women, interestingly...
They're very interesting.
Well, I mean, basically, the attitude in Iceland was it's the men that screwed it up, and it's the women that are going to have to put it right.
That's about right, isn't it?
And there was actually a lot of truth in that.
Yeah.
But the critical thing here is that the women were not constrained by any previous experience. Neither were they constrained by the old school tie or the old boy network or whatever you want to call it, the secret societies, whatever. They were literally saying, you know what, we've got a blank sheet of paper here, and the IMF tried to come in and say, well, no, you haven't actually, here's the game plan. And they said, what? Why would we ever consult with you? Yeah. You're the body that was supposed to prevent anything like this from ever happening, so why would we ever need you? So they basically told them to take a hike. And what they've done is effectively established an economy through a remarkably simple, in many respects, process. They've literally taken like the game of Monopoly.
Yeah.
And the game of Monopoly starts with all the players being given money.
Yeah.
Not loaned, given money. Well, the Icelandic government didn't just want to give people money. So what it did was they actually drew up they got all of their local authority leaders or the equivalent to draw up community projects that needed to be undertaken, and it could be filling potholes in the road, cleaning drains out, painting the houses of the elderly or the handicapped, anything like this. And so people who a few weeks previously were supposedly earning sort of mega salaries in the Icelandic banking industry, which no longer existed, of course, if they wanted to actually get some currency, they had to do these community projects. And of course there were still businesses that needed to operate, and if they needed to borrow money, they could borrow it from the government, from the Icelandic people. So effectively what Iceland has done is it's established the People's Bank of Iceland. And so when a business borrows money, sure, they pay interest on it, but it comes back to the people. It doesn't disappear into the black hole of a private financier's pocket somewhere. So right now Iceland is complete anathema to the global corporatists, and that's why nobody's reading anything about Iceland. That's why the mainstream media effectively have a total blackout on anything going on in Iceland. And the moment something does come out, as it did a few weeks ago in Portugal, with the broadcast on the Portuguese mainstream news that the Icelandic government had wiped out all mortgage debt. Now that wasn't strictly true, but there was an element of truth in it. I mean, it was somebody had got a half-cocked story and exaggerated a little bit. But nonetheless, the globalists did not want people going, well, that's interesting, and then taking a little more interest in it. What they did was they immediately shut it down and dismissed it as misinformation and a hoax. A bit like they did with Alessio.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
When Alessio went on to the BBC.
They tried making him out that he was one of the yes men, didn't they?
That he was a hoaxer.
Yeah, and he wasn't.
So anytime that you see anybody being dismissed as a hoaxer, or a report being dismissed as a hoax by the mainstream, that should be your first sort of clue to go take a closer look at what's going on. But here we are now. Iceland is effectively just 3.5 years out of this total collapse. I mean, literally total collapse. It's like the equivalent of those of us in this room having borrowed $1 million to gamble, but suddenly finding that we actually owe 10 million and we've got a total assets of nothing. I mean, there's nowhere to go. You've got nothing. Well, that was the case for the whole country. The country had effectively been fleeced of its entire cash holdings. But it hadn't let go of its natural resources. And that is, of course, what the global financiers wanted. And thanks to the women of Iceland, they have kept the global financiers at bay, and they've hung on to their natural resources, and they've said, you know what, we'll dig ourselves out of this. Now, they were so successful that late last year, the World Trade Organization started to make noises about applying sanctions to Iceland for its whaling activities. Well, of course, its whaling activities are minuscule compared to those of Japan. But this was the first sign that the World Trade Organization needed to start.
Was worried. They were worried.
They're worried.
But have we've given up all our natural resources of this country now, have we not? In here, so I mean, the same could not. We wouldn't really have the.
Well, there's a slight difference. There's a slight difference. I mean, in Ireland, this is why Ireland is the target right now, and this is why what's going on in Ireland literally over the next week is so important, because we have this event in Ireland on Sunday, and again, remarkable synchronicity. At the time we're having the break for dinner, Enda Kenny, the Irish Taoiseach Prime Minister, is actually giving a speech to the nation to try to obviously persuade them to vote yes in the referendum next Thursday. And of course, at the event at the Stillorgan Park, I mean, we'll be explaining why, to vote yes will actually be the end of the Irish people.
That won't make much difference anyway, because they're going to.
They'll just have another vote.
They'll have another vote, and as I think Thomas said, they've told them anyway it won't matter whether they vote yes.
Well, that's true, but nonetheless, it does send a massive message. And I mean, the point is that if it's a massive no vote, an absolutely massive no vote, it might just give. If there is anybody with a soul left in the Irish government, it might just give them the confidence to actually, mount a serious challenge on the basis that they've got the will of the people behind them. Now, I'm not holding out a lot of hope, but
yeah. Well, no, it's the right way to go, because much as I've already said, you look at Westminster, I actually can't see a member of Parliament with any balls or with any guts,
or with a soul,
But really, that isn't correct. There are one or two in there. I don't think they're very brave people, but the way to make those sorts of people brave is to show that they have got support out in the general public.
Yeah.
If they speak out, if they start moving in the right direction and people come in alongside and say, well done, thank you, and they get a pat on the back, I think they get braver.
Yeah.
So we can't write them all off, and you only need one or two to actually...
Well, George Galloway sent a message at the last by-election, didn't he?
Yeah, go on.
Well, it was, I mean, unfortunately, George Galloway couldn't remember which constituency he was standing in.
Yeah.
But I mean, nonetheless, the massive popular vote went from the mainstream parties.
Oh, so, yeah, sorry, you mean a message in that? I was thinking he'd written a message.
No.
What you mean?
No, sorry.
I got there in the end.
Sorry, yeah. Yeah, was it Blackburn, Burnley? Where is it I'm standing now? I mean, they speak different from what I do, but but you know, when eventually the result came through, I mean, it was incredible.
Yeah.
You know, the massive popular swing, and of course, the major parties don't take too much notice of what goes on in by-elections, but you know, nonetheless, I think it does start the process. Now, you know, what we're seeing in Ireland, though, is a deliberate attempt to get this country totally subjugated to the global corporatists because of the massive natural resources of Ireland. I mean, because of the location where Ireland sits, right on the extreme west of Europe, Ireland actually has 23% of all the EU fishing waters. But thanks to their corrupt politicians, they sold 19% of those for a one-off payment of €6 billion some years ago. And that's it. So Ireland is literally only allowed to fish 4% of what should be 23% of the EU's fishing waters. Sure. Then the next target is the enormous oil and gas deposits off the west coast of Ireland. Now, potentially, Ireland is actually sitting on more oil and gas than is in the whole of the North Sea combined between the UK and Norway. Now, it sits in quite hostile waters, about 200 miles, right on the limits of Irish territorial waters. But it sits about 200 miles offshore, right down from the northwest, right down to the southwest. And the only field that's being developed at the moment is the Corrib gas field by Shell. And again, the corrupt Irish politicians, in this case we can name the individual, it was Ray Burke, basically gave those resources to Shell. In fact, the Nigerian people got a better deal from Shell than the Irish people have in terms of the Corrib gas field. But even more concerning is the massive natural gas, shale gas, that is in a field called the Loch Allen Basin, which is right in the heart of Ireland. It actually extends into parts of Fermanagh in Northern Ireland. Now, unfortunately, the only way to really access this gas is through a process known as fracking, which is hydraulic fracturing.
Dodgy.
Well, dodgy doesn't even go halfway. Because the reality is that the fracking process is all about money now and to hell with the consequences. And the issue with fracking is that once upon a time, in the early days of fracturing, it was simply seawater pumped under enormous pressures. But of course the oil industry has become sophisticated and greedy, so it's developed these extremely toxic cocktails of chemicals which are proprietary. So whilst you can get a list of the ingredients if you're lucky, but you're certainly not going to get the the percentages. But what they do is the oil companies that pump these enormous quantities of toxic chemicals into the well to fracture the rock formations, to increase the porosity, to bring the gas to the wellhead. And then in theory, all of the toxic chemicals are flushed out, but they're flushed out into an open pit, a plastic-lined open pit, and then it just evaporates into the atmosphere. And so then it re-emerges, of course, in the rainfall. But in reality, there is no way of determining whether or not all of the chemicals have been flushed. So what is happening, particularly in areas of the US, where the fracturing operations have been going on for 4 or 5 decades, is that these chemicals migrate into the water table, which makes the water table toxic, which then of course gets into the subsoils, then of course it gets into the topsoils, and it effectively makes the whole area completely uninhabitable. You can't grow anything, the animals get sick. I mean, one of the films I would absolutely encourage people to see is Gasland. Josh Fox's film Gasland. And last year, when I was touring Ireland, giving a series of presentations called The Pillage of Ireland's Resources, I was encouraging people to watch this film. And I'm pleased to say that, you know, throughout Ireland now, there are many, many groups that are making the effort to educate the populations on the dangers associated with fracking. And of course, the issue is this: it's not the current generation that will feel the effects of it. This is why it's all about money now. Get the profit now. Basically, the effects of fracking will be felt 50, 100 or 200 years down the road. And it's why, you know, basically enormous tracts of the United States of America are becoming uninhabitable due to fracking. But of course, this is right in line with the Agenda 21 program anyway. Depopulation.
Yeah.
You know, so we can once again see how all this fits together. But Ireland has been, in my opinion, sacrificed by one of its own. And I believe that the driving force behind the subjugation of Ireland to the global financiers is none other than Peter Sutherland, an Irishman by no more than accident of birth. But I mean, this is a former Attorney General in Ireland.
Which would fit, in my opinion.
And of course, and in fact, I'll show in a second that the sitting Attorney General in 2008 was absolutely guilty of treason. We'll come back to that in a second, because he was responding to the pressure, in my opinion, put upon him by Peter Sutherland. Yeah. But Peter Sutherland, very interesting history. Of course, he was an EU Commissioner. He was the founding Director General of the World Trade Organization in 1994. He's a member of the Trilateral Commission. He's a member of the Bilderbergers. Trilateral Commission, of course, set up by Zbigniew Brzezinski in 1973, when he's working and still works directly for David Rockefeller. He was a former chairman of BP and is currently the chairman of Goldman Sachs.
My God.
And this is the guy who, in 2008, although I can't prove that he was actually physically present at the meeting, the spectre of Peter Sutherland is all over this meeting. And this meeting took place in late September of 2008. And the people who were present, there may have been others, but the people I know to have been present were Brian Cowen, at the time, who was the Taoiseach, the Prime Minister of Ireland, Brian Lenihan, who was very sick. He had pancreatic cancer, and he subsequently died about a year ago. But he was the equivalent of the Chancellor. He was at the meeting. So these were the two players, senior players in government. The third member of the Irish government who was there was Paul Gallagher, the sitting Attorney General. Now, the role of Attorney General, of course, is to make sure that the government of the day uphold the Constitution. Yeah. And that's why, in my opinion, Paul Gallagher is the one of the players here who was absolutely guilty of treason, because he should have made it clear to Cowen and Lenihan that what they were doing was unconstitutional. Yeah. But he had something in common with another member of that meeting, a guy called Dermot Gleeson, who was the chairman of Anglo-Irish Bank, which of course was on the point of collapse. Well, basically, Peter Sutherland, a very senior Bilderberger, instructed fellow Bilderbergers, Dermot Gleeson and Paul Gallagher, the sitting Attorney General, to instruct Brian Cowen and Brian Lenihan to effectively take all of the liabilities of the Irish banks and have them underwritten by the Irish taxpayer. And that was the moment, that was the absolute moment that the Irish people were condemned to lives of future abject misery, pending a massive change in direction. And unfortunately, of course, we haven't seen that change in direction, despite the fact that Cowen's government was taken out of power, and new government under Enda Kenny came into office a little over a year ago. And now, you know, we have this referendum on May the 31st, where the Irish people have the opportunity to vote on the acceptance of the European Stability Mechanism, which is an absolute misnomer because it should be called the European Debt Mechanism. So what the Irish people are actually voting on is whether they absolutely condemn the nation of Ireland to the dustbin of history, and condemn future generations to lives of absolute abject economic misery in slavery to the global financiers, or open the door, and it is only going to be a crack, open the door just a crack and let in a glimmer of light that maybe, just maybe, tells Enda Kenny that there is such massive support from the Irish people that he actually can go tell the IMF and the European Central Bank to go take a hike.
Yeah.
And that's going to take absolute massive balls on his part, but of course he wouldn't be in office if there was any fear that he might do that. But the reality is, this is an amazing opportunity. The Irish are the only people in Europe who have it in their constitution, thanks to a wonderful guy by the name of Raymond Crotty, more of in a second. But thanks to Raymond Crotty, it's the only nation in Europe that has written into its constitution that there has to be a referendum of the people on every occasion that the government wants to hand sovereign power over to a foreign entity. In the UK, we just gift it. In every other nation in Europe, they just gift it away to Brussels. So Ireland has this incredible opportunity, and like I said, the reason they have this opportunity is because of this amazing guy, Raymond Crotty, who back in the 1970s could see that the whole of the EEC policy and philosophy was about the destruction of his beloved nation. Now, he was a Kilkenny farmer, and he knew that no one was going to take a blind bit of notice of a Kilkenny farmer. So he went to college as a mature student and graduated with a degree in agricultural economics. And he was revered in places like South America and Southeast Asia, where he spent much of his career, because nobody would listen to him in Ireland. But he did write a series of books, and everything that Raymond Crotty was writing about in the 70s and 80s has unfortunately come into pass. But Raymond Crotty's legacy to the Irish people, and it's a travesty that so few of the Irish people know this, is that the Irish government in 1986 was about to sign over an enormous tranche of power to the EEC. And Crotty took the Irish government to court, and even though initially the ruling was against him and in favour of the government, but his legal team spotted some issues with the judge's summation, so they pursued it to the next level, and ultimately in April of 1987, the Supreme Court ruled that Raymond Crotty had a point, and that it was indeed unconstitutional for the government of Ireland to hand over sovereign power without a referendum. And so that is the reason, to this day, why Ireland has the right to a referendum on these issues. But unfortunately, this may be the last chance they ever have.
Right, but perhaps we can put in here that this is the proof that one man can make a difference.
Absolutely.
If we're looking on things to bring people up, that,
yes,
you know, he's created a door for them, and if they open it, that's good. But they were given the opportunity to do something.
And one of the speakers at the event on Sunday, Anthony Coughlin, was a very close associate with Raymond Crotty. And Raymond Crotty unfortunately died in 1994. But Raymond Crotty and Coughlin worked very closely together, and Anthony Coughlin will be speaking immediately prior to my presentation in Dublin on Sunday afternoon.
So, well, we might as well stick with this for a minute then. So Sunday is the Stillorgan Hotel. Stillorgan Park, Dublin. It starts at 1 o'clock, doors open at 12 noon. Right. It's €45 for the whole day. Individual sessions start at €15. The evening session with Max Kaiser and John Perkins is €30. So hopefully there's something for everybody's pocket there. Yeah.
I think it's going to be a great day.
Can we just run through the list of speakers?
The list of speakers on the day will be Thomas Sheridan, then William Engdahl, the author of a book called Gods of Money. And
he wrote Seeds of Destruction.
He did. Well, he wrote Seeds of Destruction. William is an economist, so this is his. This is very much his area. But yes, back in 2007, he wrote a book called Seeds of Destruction, which was his investigation into the GM food industry. Then we have Anthony Coughlin. Then myself. Then we have a dinner break, and then in the evening we have Max and Stacey, followed by John Perkins.
Fantastic.
By the way, I just want to share a little anecdote with you, because something quite remarkable happened on the very first occasion that I mentioned Raymond Crotty in a presentation in Dublin. And that was a presentation that I gave on October 22nd, I believe it was, in 2010, with Jim Core of the Cause. And we thought it was going to be a one-off, which is why we had it filmed. But it was so well received that even before we got out of the hotel the following morning, we'd already had a dozen requests to take the presentation elsewhere in Ireland. And Jim and I actually ended up doing 2 tours. So we did something like 24 dates around Ireland, explaining exactly what we're talking about right now in November and December of 2010. But anyway, in that presentation in October, I introduced Raymond Crotty. And the tragedy is that many people in the audience in Dublin had never heard of Raymond Crotty. That's how effectively he'd been snubbed from history. But the following day, I was flying back from Dublin to Exeter Airport, and the plane wasn't very full. But when the plane landed, the lady sitting adjacent to me threw the book that she'd been reading onto the seat when she stood up to get her bags from the overhead locker. And I couldn't help but notice that the book she was reading was a book by Raymond Crotty. And I got off the plane. I'd never seen anybody reading a Raymond Crotty book before. So I got off the plane, and we had to get on one of those buses to go to the terminal. So the bus wasn't very full. So I walked up to the lady and I said, "Excuse me, ma'am." I said, "But I couldn't help noticing that you were reading a book by Raymond Crotty." I said, coincidentally, I was giving a presentation in Dublin last night, and I referenced the work of Raymond. I said, "Are you familiar with his work?" Well, her husband laughed and said, "Well, she should be, because this is Mary, his daughter."
How funny.
And they were on the plane coming to Exeter because they were going to spend the weekend with her son, Raymond's grandson, who's studying agricultural economics at Falmouth University in Cornwall. Well, not being one to just sort of let that kind of coincidence slip by, I immediately got home. I immediately ordered the full suite of Raymond Crotty's books. So when I went back to Ireland to do this tour with Jim, I was effectively giving a presentation through the eyes of Raymond Crotty, rather than a Brit commenting on the Irish economy. And I should be doing exactly the same when I go to Dublin next week. Anthony Cochran, that's why I've linked Anthony Cochran and myself, because Anthony Cochran worked very closely with Raymond Crotty, and I want to basically present what I think would be the take of what's going on right now through the eyes of Raymond Crotty.
Right, fantastic. So from Dublin then we move on to Manchester.
The following Saturday, and that is at the Middleton Arena, which is just to the north of Manchester. It's a very easy to get to location. It's just off the M60 and the M62, and plenty of parking there. It's the Middleton Arena, and it's ostensibly the same programme. It starts at 1 o'clock on Saturday and runs through till 9:30 on Saturday evening. And then the following day, the roadshow moves down to London, where we're joined by Brian.
Thank you very much.
And Brian will, in fact, I won't be speaking per se in London. I'm going to be emceeing the event. So the speakers in London will be Brian Gerrish, Alessio Rastani, again giving his... Why does that always bring a smile to your face, Lou?
Because you start smiling when you ask
you make me grin. It's your fault.
So Alessio Rastani, who will again be giving advice on how people can avoid getting caught up in the drama that's going to unfold. Thomas Sheridan, and this Thomas Sheridan is absolutely fantastic. I mean, I think the whole event is worth it just to go hear Thomas Sheridan in many respects. And that's it before we even get on to Max Kaiser and Stacey and John Perkins. So this is an incredible lineup.
It's going to be great.
And I think all three events, I mean, the timing is remarkable. I think, more and more people are, of course, waking up to the magnitude of the fraud and the deception of the global corporatists. And in my opinion, Lou, I think they're actually playing a rearguard action right now. I think they know that basically it's all over by the shouting. They're going to hang on as long as they possibly can. Obviously, they want to, like the game of Monopoly, they want to take total ownership of the board. But I think that...
it's the Jubilee weekend as well.
Well, of course it is. But I've worked on the basis that those who are interested in what we have to say ain't going to be too interested in what the wearer of the £1 million hat is doing on the Thames. And I mean, let's absolutely understand that the governments of any nation right now have no comprehension of the word austerity. They banter it around as though it's the sort of mantra that's going to get everybody out of the mire. When these guys have no comprehension of the word. You know, I mean, even Bruton, the Irish politician, a few days ago said everyone should be prepared to earn less. But, you know, of course, I mean, he gets multiple incomes from his various pensions from past offices held. But he ain't about to cut his income. Well, none of these people are about to cut their income.
Hague was, I think, last week, Hague came out and said everyone needs to be working a bit harder. Yeah. You know, to get us out of this mess, everyone needs to work a bit harder.
Well, William Hague is going to work very, very hard because he knows damn well that somebody's sitting on some photographs that they paid £20,000 for that aren't being published. And I think we have to... Well, we know this for a fact because it was actually stated at the Leveson inquiry. We know for a fact that Andy Coulson, when he was working as David Cameron's PR manager, and Andy Coulson, former editor of the News of the World, it was stated as fact that Andy Coulson instructed the News of the World to buy a set of photographs featuring William Hague for £20,000.
Yeah.
Now, you don't buy a set of family album photographs for £20,000.
No, you don't.
And then not publish them.
No.
So somebody somewhere is sitting on some photographs that they paid £20,000 for. And I think on the basis that William Hague knows who's purchased those photographs, William Hague will do anything he's told to do, which is why he's banging the drum now for war with Iran. And of course, you know, basically once a politician has been compromised, then, you know, their integrity is obviously totally shot.
Yeah.
Well, if I may, it's funny because for the audience, this is a totally unrehearsed programme. We haven't discussed the content and it hasn't been pre-planned, but I've got Andy Coulson down here. So a little bit earlier I was talking about Mr. Hilton, and of course we got Andy Coulson, and the thing that was pointed out about him is unvetted, so without his background being checked as to whether he was a safe man to be acting with matters to do with this country. He was sitting in on meetings where he had no clearances to do so. So this makes me particularly, so I'm just getting some instructions there because I'm going to speak up a bit, that my military background days, people could lose their career for losing one page of a document. So every 3 months or whatever it was, classified books were checked to make sure every page was in place, and where there had been changes made, the correct pages were in place. You lose one page and you lost your career. And yet here we have people in government who are, I use the word, mincing around in meetings. And who are these people? It's incredible. The other point I'd like to make is the fact that if we look at what's happened with positions in the public sector over the last 10, 15 years, we've seen this massive rise in salaries for people in public sector. So you take the chief executive of Plymouth City Council here, who I believe is on about 165,000. We've got chief executives on the greatest rate, which I think was the lady in Suffolk, was on about 235,000, more than the Prime Minister. Why do you put these people on the vast salaries? One, so that when they're used to getting 10 grand a month, they're going to do what they're told. But also, as these so-called austerity measures come in, the measures are not going to hurt the people who are doing the government's bidding. So this is the control mechanism of these very high salaries. And the other thing, which I regard as a coincidence, is that when you initially suggested about the talk, you said to me about the talk in London, and you said, well, Brian, the theme is going to be money. Are you happy to go into that area? I had agreed to do a talk in Penzance, so down there in the tip of Cornwall, and I decided that I would have a look in some of my records to material I had when the early European Union funding came in. And for Cornwall, that was £320 million of Objective 1 funding. The moment that money touched Cornwall, the fraud and the corruption started. And because I'd dug all that work out, and you then said the subject's money, and I'm thinking this is a coincidence. So serendipity, or somebody's looking after us. But that'll be part of what I'm going to talk about in London. Yeah, money controlling people. But I think we're interested to know a bit more about you, actually.
Yes.
Oh, really?
Yes. No, everyone's seen your YouTube videos. People have gone to see you speak, but you've got a massive following now, but not many people know how it all started and where and how you got to be where you are now. So let's rewind.
Well, I think actually, to be fair, those people who, like I said to you earlier, there are some people who actually know my presentations better than I. And I think it was Fool Me Once. Where I actually told the story of how I got into all this. Well, I'm a slow learner, a very slow learner, and I was actually 34 years of age. So for those of you who are interested, that was 21 years ago. I was 34 years of age when I was one of the first civilians to go into Kuwait. Why are you smiling, Lou? I haven't mentioned Alessio.
Oh, really?
This is a birthday issue. Don't worry about it.
That was a genuine smile. Okay. Yeah. So here I was. It was late March of 1991. And I was working with an oilfield services company called Schlumberger. I was based in Dubai in the Middle East. And when hostilities were over, supposedly, the oilfield services companies were given permission to go in, and our job, I was with 3 or 4 other colleagues from other companies, and our job was to take a look at the logistics that were going to be required to deal with the burning wells.
Okay.
Well, we were going into uncharted territory. I mean, I was not joining the dots at the time because I wasn't looking for dots that needed to be joined. But, when I look back, in October of 1990, so that was 3 months into the Desert Shield operation, which was the massive build-up of troops in Saudi Arabia. And in October of 1990, we got word coming down through the hierarchy of Schlumberger, which had apparently come from the US State Department, that we need to start gearing up for a massive firefighting exercise.
Okay.
October of 1990. So, it was good just as well that we did get a bit of a heads up, because at the time, dealing with a blowout was, something that needed, particularly special skills, but it didn't happen very often. So as it happens, we had one guy in the whole company, and I remember the guy's name very clearly. It was a guy called Wayne Sledge, and he was from the deep south in the US, and he was the only guy, really. He was our blowout specialist. Wherever there was a blowout, if Schlumberger were called upon to participate in dealing with the blowout, it was Wayne that you brought in.
Okay.
So at the time, Wayne was actually dealing with a blowout that had occurred in an offshore rig off of the coast of India. So during a sort of break from that, I flew him over to Dubai to have a chat with him, to ask him, what he needed to train a bunch of people to deal with a major firefighting exercise. And of course I still really had no idea what that meant per se. And anyway, so after a discussion with Wayne, I thought, okay, we can establish a sort of a school, a firefighting school in Dubai. We can fake a blowout BOP, blowout preventer. And anyway, so Wayne went back off to India. And then, of course, come March, with the push of the US and Allied troops to get the Iraqis out of Kuwait City and force them back to Iraq, of course the wells were all set alight. And the official version of events is that it was the retreating Iraqi troops that set the wells alight. But, when we were driving around the wells in southern Kuwait, it was increasingly obvious to me that the physical evidence didn't support the official version of events. And the physical evidence was quite poignant. And that was the young Iraqi conscripts who were still in their foxholes around the burning wells on a perimeter, like they were protecting the wells, and with bullet holes in the backs of their necks. So it just looked to me like they'd been assassinated by special forces coming through, take out the defensive troops, probably in the dark of night, and then set the wells alight. And then, of course, when I got to the northern wells, what I witnessed on that drive was really horrendous, because what had happened was, as the American troops and the Allies came up on a sort of pincer movement,
to Kuwait City, forcing all of the Iraqi conscripts to leave Kuwait City, and they literally piled into anything they could get their hands on.
Yeah.
School buses, pickup trucks, anything. And of course they piled all their booty onto these trucks, and they were literally driving on what is a 6-lane highway. It's a 6-lane highway that run between Kuwait City and Basra.
Right.
But it went up a gentle incline, and eventually it went between two sort of rock outcrops.
Yeah.
And then over the other side of the rock outcrop, the road gently dropped down towards Iraq. What happened is, as these 6 lanes of retreating Iraqis got to the point between the rocks, the Americans had their helicopter gunships lying just over the horizon. And of course what they did was they launched a rocket attack on the lead vehicles, which blocked the road. And then the helicopters literally went down the sides of the highway, literally rocketing and strafing everything. It was a turkey shoot. It was a war crime of the absolute highest order. And when we were there, all that happened, this is how quickly we were following through, and the Americans had a bulldozer, literally just pushed the vehicles to one side, so you literally had to weave your way up through the vehicles. Over the next few weeks, what they did was they dug a massive trench either side of the highway and shoveled all of the vehicles into the trench. How many Iraqi troops were murdered in that attack? Goodness only knows. But it was horrendous. It was totally unnecessary, and it was George Bush Sr.'s retribution on the Iraqis, because obviously the Arab alliance had told him that you're not going to go to Baghdad, because the terms of the agreement were just to get the Iraqis out of Kuwait. Well, I also knew, of course, that in Dubai it was common knowledge that the Iraqis had been baited into invading Kuwait when Donald Rumsfeld when April Glaspie met with Saddam in April Glaspie was the US ambassador to Iraq.
Right, okay.
And she met with Saddam about, I think it was like the 3rd week of July of 1990. And Saddam had sort of expressed his concern that the Kuwaiti oil company were directional drilling into the neutral zone and effectively tapping into reservoirs that were agreed off limits, i.e. they were in a neutral zone and they were therefore not to be tapped. But what was happening is the directional drilling technology was really quite sophisticated even back then, and so directional drilling was tapping into these reservoirs in the neutral zone. Saddam knew about it, and so he told April Glaspie that he needed to take some action to deal with it. And April Glaspie basically said, I'm instructed to tell you that the US government has no interest in Arab conflict. So Saddam, bear in mind, he thought that he was an ally of the US because they had been providing him with all the weapons during the Iran-Iraq war from 1980 through 1988. So he thought this was the green light from an ally to basically go do whatever he needed to do with Kuwait. Well, of course, he unfortunately fell for the bait, hook, line and proverbial sinker. And the rest, as they say, of course, is history. The objective, of course, was clearly for the US to take control of the Iraqi oil fields way back in the early 1990s. But of course, the Arab alliance basically said, no. That wasn't the agreement at all. The agreement was simply to get the Iraqis out of Kuwait, and if you think you're going to take it any further, then you're out of here.
Okay.
You're no longer going to have the right of access through Saudi Arabia. So of course that's why the moment that George W. Bush was appointed president by the Supreme Court in December of 2000, at that exact moment, Saddam announced that he was no longer sell his oil in petrodollars, that it would be sold in euros from this point forward, because that was his way of sort of getting back at George W. Bush, or George Bush Sr. rather. And in fact, that move, selling the Iraqi oil in euros, really hurt the US. And that's why George W. Bush was instructed to accelerate his attack on Iraq. And despite the fact that millions of people all around the world, I think it was late February of 2003, protested against the imminence of an attack on a sovereign nation under this false guise of weapons of mass destruction. But of course,
our then Prime Minister had an awful lot to do.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he's got more blood on his hands than many other leaders around the planet. But they took no notice at all. I mean, this was totally overriding the will of the people to launch yet another illegal invasion on the sovereign nation. And of course, this time the goal was indeed the oil fields. And a lot of people remember George Bush swooping onto the USS Lincoln in flying dress,
Top Gun, wasn't it? He was playing Top Gun
to make his announcement that the mission accomplished. There was a big banner on the back on the ship that said mission accomplished. Well, of course, a lot of people, in fact most people, thought that mission accomplished was a reference to the military operation. In fact, that they were now in Baghdad and that was it. Effectively, the game was won. But it wasn't. What mission accomplished was indicating was it was a signal to the global financial community that from this day forward, Iraqi oil is once again being traded in petrodollars. So, when you know the rules of the game, you know what to look for. Well, like I said, I was a slow learner. After my experience in Kuwait in 1991, I actually made the mistake of sort of sharing my observations with our driver, who obviously shared it with his superiors. And a couple of days later, I was sitting in the mess in Ahmadi, the headquarters of the Kuwaiti Oil Company. And this guy in battle fatigues, interestingly, with absolutely no identification on him whatsoever, but it was a big guy, about 300-pound gorilla. And he stormed up to the table, and he knew exactly who I was. He just walked over to me and he said, "You're Ian Crane?" And I just sort of looked up, didn't say anything. And he said, "I've been hearing you've been casting some aspersion about who set their wells alight." And I still didn't say anything. And he said, "Boy," he said, "that's the kind of thinking that can get you into a whole lot of trouble. And you best be keeping your mouth shut." And then I still hadn't said anything at this point. And then he turned to walk away. And as he walked away, he turned and looked over his shoulder. And he, in a different tone of voice, he said, "Ian, what the fuck's the matter? Aren't we paying you enough?" Well, I'm telling that story very glibly 21 years down the road. But at the time, let me tell you, I was rather concerned for my own safety. I didn't sleep very well until I actually got back to Dubai, because obviously I thought, my God, if these guys are prepared to perpetrate a deception of this magnitude, what the hell are they going to do if they think that I'm going to blow the whistle on it? But you've got to remember, this is before the days of the internet. Yeah. So I couldn't exactly go down and just write a blog on what I'd seen. No. I was in Dubai, short of making a phone call to somebody or sending a letter off. I mean, that was the way of communication. Of course, yeah. At that time. We hadn't got this instant access. And I can be honest with you, I didn't sleep very well at all until I got back to Dubai. And then eventually, of course, I put it to the back of my mind and, got on with what I was supposed to be getting on with. And I stayed in the Middle East, actually, for another 2 years before moving on to another assignment. And then over the next few years, I was working on a project where I was based in London, acquisition project, and then I was working on an IT project, and then I went to the US to take up the role of a leadership role, a leadership role with
we won't hold that against you.
A company called Dow Schlumberger in the US, a part of the Schlumberger organisation, and having spent 3.5 years running that part of Schlumberger in the US, that's what gave me a lot of the insights that actually enabled me to put the pieces of the jigsaw together in the way I do today. So, although I was a slow learner, I think it was an important, steady progression, because it was eventually in 1998 when I finally came to the realisation that this is not what I want to be doing for the next 20 years of my life. I was fast approaching 20 years with Schlumberger. And I was, I think, 41 at the time. And I decided that I wanted to get out of the oil industry, or out of the corporate world. And in fact, I did leave, and I spent a year playing golf. And I was actually sort of getting my head in a new space, as it were. Yeah. But I did get lured back into the corporate world. I joined a company called Lucent Technologies, where I was based in Amsterdam for 18 months. And this was immediately prior to the bursting of the dot-com bubble. Okay. And this was yet another incredible insight. In fact, I sometimes joke that I learned as much, if not more, working for 18 months in the IT industry as I did working for nearly 20 years in the oil industry. because what I came up against in the IT industry, and interestingly enough, my boss in Lucent was a guy called Ben Verwaayen, who, when Lucent collapsed, became Chief Executive Officer of British Telecom. And he was with British Telecom for about 7-8 years or so. But after 18 months with Lucent, I mean, I absolutely realised that I had done all my time that I was going to do in the corporate world. And I really wanted to start focusing on my other areas of interest, which was geopolitics. But in addition, I've always had this very deep interest in the knowledge and the wisdom of indigenous and ancient peoples.
Yeah.
And during my time in the Middle East, I spent a lot of time, researching the Egyptology, and obviously I was in the prime position to do that. And then in 2000, in April of 2000, I took the opportunity to do a 6-month assignment in Central America, studying Mayan mythology and Mayan cosmology. And that's where I was when 9/11 went down. And in the period that I was in Central America, George W. Bush had been appointed president in December. He'd been sworn in January. I had gone into Central America in late March, early April of 2001. And obviously sitting around in the evenings over a beer or whatever, many Americans there, so we'd be talking, American or particularly American foreign policy. And I was making the observation, I said, you know what? George Bush is being sat on the bench. He's waiting for something. Because at the time, he wasn't participating in any way, shape or form. And what a lot of people don't realise is that the US president actually has very little to do in terms of domestic politics. Because the state governor, an individual state governor, actually has more autonomy than any European prime minister right now.
Not so much now, is it?
Even now. Although they're desperately trying to erode it, of course, but it is still the case. But so because George Bush had absolutely no experience whatsoever in the global arena, I mean, he proved his ignorance, in the hustings, and of course he did nothing. I mean, he was never in Washington. He spent most of his time either on the golf course, or on his ranch in Crawford, Texas. And I said, there's something. They are literally waiting to launch this guy on the world stage. So I said, right now, he's actually probably going through, some kind of very, very deep briefing in preparation and coaching for whatever role it is that he's going to take once they launch whatever it is they're going to launch. Now, I had no idea what it was. I had no idea what was coming. But there I was, on the morning of September the 11th. I was in my last few days in Belize, in Central America, because my ticket had always been booked to leave, in fact, Guatemala, but I changed the ticket, obviously. But I was booked to fly out of Guatemala City on September the 15th, 2001. That had always been the case. But I was going through my usual routine, which was going down to a bar called the Purple Space Monkey in a place called Plasencia in Belize. And I would go down at 8 o'clock when the bar opened, have breakfast, and the satellite TV would be on. Well, of course, Belize is 1 hour behind New York. So at 8 o'clock in the morning or 8:15 or whatever, I was watching 9/11 unfold. And initially, of course, I was just as gobsmacked as everyone else. But I have to say, and I hate to reveal this, but when the first tower collapsed, I applauded because I went, this is it. This is it. This is the event. This is the event that George W. Bush has been waiting for to launch him onto the world stage. And of course, when the second tower went down, I knew beyond any reasonable doubt. It still took me 7 months. 7 months after I came back from Belize. It took me 7 months. It was April 2002 before I eventually came to the ultimate conclusion that there was no other possibility for this event than it being an inside job. I mean, because all the evidence I'd accumulated.
So this triggered you. So what made you decide, to do something about it, to talk to people?
Well, in fact, to be honest, the first presentation I gave was actually in Exeter in 2003, January 2003. Right. And I had an audience of 3 people. All of them, they come along separately, and all of them acknowledged that they come along to see who this idiot was who thought that...
And what were you talking about?
Just 9/11.
Just 9/11.
Just 9/11 at the time. And but anyway, they listened to what I had to say, and I'd accumulated, and I still have a massive photographic and video library of events from that day. Yeah. And they all acknowledged at the end of the evening that I had definitely given them food for thought. And for the next two and a half years, I focused just on 9/11. Right. But when the London bombings occurred, I knew at that point that basically this was, part of the global agenda. The G8, the Olympics being awarded to London the day before. Yes. Yeah. And in fact, I gave a presentation at exactly the same time as John Charles de Menzies was being assassinated at Stockwell Tube Station. Literally, I recorded a presentation called the 9/11 7/7 Connection. And that was probably the moment that I decided that I had the luxury of time and the background knowledge to be able to do this research. And I'm not a writer; that's not my forte. But I've always all through my career. I mean, it's public speaking, if you like, or presentation has been a part of my job. So I felt very comfortable in sharing this information through presentation. And so in 2005, that was the first one that we actually recorded as a presentation was in July of 2006, and that presentation is called Hidden Agenda 2012. Yeah. And everything I talked about in that presentation 6 years ago is effectively coming to pass as we speak today.
I think it was Fool Me Once in 2007 that you recorded at Glastonbury. That's what woke me up after 9/11 in plain sight and seeing that presentation. That's what woke me up.
Well, the good news today, Lou, is that I can tell you when I was doing the research back in 2001, 2002, it was a very lonely occupation. Yeah. And there was a handful of people. And thankfully, we had the web. If we hadn't had the web at that point, it wouldn't have
never come to.
No, it would never have come together. But there was a handful of people sharing information at that time. Today it's a completely different ballgame. Yeah. We are a long way from where we were 11 years ago. 11 years ago. Like I said, when I gave the presentation on 9/11 in Exeter in January 2003, 3 people turned up. Today, I can conduct a presentation anywhere in the UK, and it'll be
it's not
give or
just
take
the UK,
100.
Is it really? And you've recently come back from a trip to Australia and New Zealand.
Yeah. Thanks to the power of YouTube.
And where else? What other European?
Sweden, and of course, in the past 2 years, I've done more talks in Ireland than probably anywhere else. Yeah. I think I've done 60 talks in Ireland in the past 2 years. But this is indicative of the, and of course after my revelations about the BP Deepwater Horizon disaster, where again because of my background, I was literally able to name the individual who was put on the rig to make it happen.
Just say his name once more.
Bob Kaluza. And of course if I was wrong, then BP and Bob Kaluza should have been trying to nail my butt for libelous or slanderous statements. But of course they won't. They daren't. No. They actually daren't draw attention to my revelations because I might not be 100% accurate, but I'm a lot closer to the truth than any of the investigations.
Just because I know time's ticking on, I'm not quite sure what we've got left now, but how do you see things going at the moment? We could do it 2 ways. How do you see things going if we don't do anything? How do you see things going if people start to do the right things?
Okay, well listen, I think that, let me sum up quickly. It is only when we go through deep personal trauma in our lives that we are truly living. The rest of the time, we're just existing. We're existing in a routine. Unfortunately, of course, to shake us out of that routine, something pretty negative has to come along, pull the rug out from under our safe, comfortable routine, and that can be loss of a job, a relationship going sour, health issues, money issues, whatever. But it forces us to reflect on the way in which we're actually living our lives. Well, consider what's happening right now is perhaps the same thing on a macro level. So maybe on a positive basis, and I'm not suggesting for one moment that those who perpetrate this agenda think this on a conscious level, but collectively, maybe what they're doing is they're giving humanity this massive collective kick up the backside and saying, look, you've got a choice here. Your choice is to condemn your future generations to lives of absolute abject misery, or realise who the hell you truly are
and do something
about
Power
it.
Yourself. Yeah, fantastic.
Do you think people are beginning to respond now? You're out there on the circuit. What do you what do you perceive?
I think we've got a long, long way to go. I mean, I'm in this for the long haul. It always amuses me that, you know, people who suddenly see what's going on one day, then they immediately think that everybody else should be able to see it.
Yeah.
Yeah, they don't understand that it's a long process. It's a long haul. And of course, what we're trying to get to, and Buckminster Fuller famously said that the only thing he wanted on his epitaph was "Here lies Trim Tab." Well, being a former Navy guy, you probably instantly know what a trim tab is. I didn't. I had to go research it.
Yeah.
Well, trim tab is a little piece that's added to the back of a rudder of a ship.
Okay.
Because if a ship's at full throttle, the force of the water coming down the side of the ship keeps the rudder basically straight.
Oh, right, okay.
And so it takes an enormous amount of energy to actually turn the rudder. Well, now, back in the days of wooden sailing ships, it was all done by ropes and pulleys. But then somebody came up with the idea that if you actually attach just a little piece to the back of the rudder, which is called a trim tab, all you have to do is turn that trim tab just a fraction, and the sudden force that brings on the water makes it really easy to turn the whole of the rudder. And so what Buckminster Fuller was saying is, you know, you don't have to be looking to change what's going on with the whole population, just enough to kickstart the process. And then it will happen. Now, another way of talking about this, of course, is the 100th monkey. Yeah. Now, I have no idea where we are in terms of reaching that 100th monkey. But, you know, more and more people are waking up to this. And we know that once people do see through the veil of deceit and deception, there's no turning back.
No, it is Pandora's box. Once it's open and you see it, there's no going back.
Exactly.
We had a nice little experience a couple of days ago because an elderly gentleman quietly walks into the office and I said, "Can I help you?" And he said, "Well, I'd like some papers." So he came upstairs, and when we said to him, how do you know about the paper? He said, "Well, actually, my son has been reading it. And to be honest, I thought you were all mad initially, but now I'm seeing it." And it was such a wonderful compliment. You know, so we also see that people are waking up.
Well, and it's a team effort. Yeah. I mean, it's a team effort. No one person really can make a blind bit of difference on their own. I mean, it is about a team effort, and you know, when I get people phoning me up and saying, "What can I do?" I just simply say, "Follow your heart," you know, because I don't know what skills people have, what time they have, what resources they have. Follow your heart, because even if you share this with one person, you're making a contribution.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're out of time, guys. Practically. Next week, Malcolm's going to be presenting it because.
Should we say that he's hurt himself if people want to know what
yes, Malcolm isn't here today and he won't be presenting the news this week. I think we've got Danny Bamping's coming in to present the news, UK column news. Yeah, he's hurt himself, hasn't he? Had a bit of an accident. Malcolm hurt himself, didn't he?
Yeah.
So he's back in next week though. Get well soon, Malcolm. Hope you get fixed.
He'll tell you the story.
He can tell the story. So he's going to be back in next week. Ian Crane, thank you so much. And
thank you, Lou.
Financial Terrorism Exposed kicks off Dublin this weekend, this Sunday.
This Sunday, 1 o'clock.
Stillorgan Hotel. And Manchester and London next week. Tickets still available on www.economichitman.co.uk. And that's it for this week, isn't it?
Brilliant. Thanks very
much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks, Brian. Thanks for having us, TNS.